And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today as we're showcasing our faculty research grant recipients from 2022 and presenting about their projects. And I'm very happy to turn the floor over to Dr. Daniela Messina and Dr. Kelly Reiss to tell us more about their water testing and awareness project. So Kelly and Daniela.
Many thanks, Jennifer. So hello all, and thanks for spending some time with us today. And before we get started, we wanted to thank Dee and her team and the research grants for their support and for this opportunity. And I'm going to stop here for just a second to ask anyone else if they're hearing any kind of echo.
Yes, I was getting a little bit of an echo there.
Okay, I'm not quite sure where it's coming from, but I'm going to go ahead and proceed. So welcome to our presentation and introduction of WaterTAP, which is the Water Testing and Awareness Project, building environmental science data collection and analysis into the curriculum. I'm Daniela Messina, and I'm here today with my colleague, Kelly Reiss, to discuss our citizen science project, which collectively impacts our APUS community and the public good. So citizen science presents participants with real-world experience with science topics that might otherwise be unavailable to them in their day-to-day lives. So within this context, the Water Testing and Awareness Project, or WaterTAP, was designed to connect users with the means to test their local drinking water quality and report their results. So drinking water quality not only affects end users in both the low energy areas, but also in highly industrialized areas. WaterTAP presents the opportunity for participants to evaluate their local drinking water quality, made familiar through high-profile news stories, which we've all heard about, highlighting human health concerns such as those that we've heard from Flint, Michigan, for example, and most recently in Jackson, Mississippi. And if you take a look at our title slide, you'll see the main topics that we're going to be presenting today. And I'm going to take you through and step you through the first one, which is how we designed our project, and chat a bit about our objectives, research questions, and methods. So WaterTAP participants voluntarily conduct hands-on testing of water samples using a water analysis test kit that can detect 11 parameters, including lead and coliform bacteria. Participants report results via an online data entry form, thereby building our database. And WaterTAP currently has over 200 reported results from across the United States. Our design concept utilizes the underlying ideas of citizen science, namely to invite our students to voluntarily participate in the scientific process. In our case, it's in testing drinking water quality. It allows direct participation of our students and helps them make further connections to their water, something that's critical in the daily lives of themselves and their loved ones. It also introduces and broadens their understanding of the cradle to grave concept. It's meaningful, it's relevant, and it's easy to do. And lastly, demonstrates how they can be citizen scientists in our ever-expanding digital world. For our objectives, we included having students participate in hands-on water analysis using the individual test kits that we provide, running the tests, and reporting the results in our online data entry tool. We also developed an exercise for EVSP Water Science, a core course in the BS Environmental Science program, having students analyze a portion of the WaterTAP community data set, and then integrating the WaterTAP community data set into additional courses in the form of discussions, assignments, or projects. And that's a piece that we're still working on outside of the EVSP Water Science. The research questions that we wanted to address are, does my local drinking water supply meet regulatory guidelines for drinking water standards as identified under the Safe Drinking Water Act? And across the APUS community, does preferred drinking water supply, whether it's tap, well water, or others such as a small community well, meet these regulatory guidelines? So how do we do what we do, which is the methods? So to bring awareness of drinking water quality and analysis, these volunteer participants, our students, conduct testing of water samples. And these samples can be locations from home offices, their homes, their outside offices, or other supplies of interest. The testing utilizes a readily available water analysis test kit that can detect parameters such as lead, pesticide, coliform bacteria, iron, nitrates, chlorine, copper, alkalinity, pH, and/or water hardness. And we use the Test Assured Complete Water Analysis Test Kit that you see in the lower left-hand corner. The students, if you want to take an overview of the process path that the students take, they start off with voluntarily completing our test kit request online form. They receive their free testing kit via USPS. They run the included tests. They'll then report their results into the online form, and this records the data into the WaterTAP database. So with that said, Kelly is now going to take you on a bit of a deeper dive into what's driven the WaterTAP's conception and what we have found to date.
All right, well, thanks everyone. As mentioned, WaterTAP was conceived after hearing about several high-profile news stories relating to human health impacts stemming from drinking water contamination. And so in order to understand the importance of clean drinking water and how it's regulated, I wanted to share some highlights into the motivation for drinking water testing as the foundation for our student-driven community science project. Students are learning about these regulations in their academic classroom, and WaterTAP offers them a tangible and a personal pathway for them to connect to these topics. The regulations of drinking water vary from the type of water system. So in red here, we have the public water systems, and these are regulated by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And this is shown in the left column of the chart. And this makes up the bulk of what we drink here in the United States, something like 2/3 to 3/4 of our water supply that we get in our own homes and businesses is the public supply. In the middle column, we see the individual water systems. Mostly these are private wells, and they could be some other types of privately owned or smaller systems as well. And then on the far right of your screen, you see that bottled water is regulated not under the EPA, but through the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And we currently don't have any bottled water in our testing, although students were able to select that as they had chosen to. But it looks like most of our students are drinking right out of their taps. All right, so water contamination, it's been in the news frequently in recent years. Likely the water contamination case you are most familiar with is a high-profile case out of Flint, Michigan. This concerned lead contamination, but it also included several other concerns, from the biological concerns of Legionnaire's disease and fecal coliform bacteria to chemicals such as the trihalomethanes or TTHMs, also present in the drinking water supply. Much more recently, in the fall of 2022, the city of Jackson, Mississippi has been in the news for its drinking water quality and distribution troubles. And just this March 2023, there was a public scare for the potential contamination for a large city like Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And there were concerns with chemical spills in the tributary to their main water source. So depending on your own location, there have been many other local and regional drinking water contamination cases that you've probably heard about, from New York, New Jersey. There were neurotoxins and pipe corrosion, to Enterprise, Louisiana, with lead and biological concerns, to Denmark, South Carolina, with detectable concentrations of a disinfectant that's not approved for human consumption. And this really is just to name a few of the different stories that you may have heard regarding drinking water. So while waterborne disease reporting did begin in the U.S. back in the 1920s, it wasn't until the 1970s that regulations were developed to address drinking water quality, beginning with the passage of the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974, with interim standards developed a year later, followed by the adoption of the National Primary Drinking Water Standards and amendments a decade later. You can see the date on these, and a lot of these are the standards that we're using as a comparison for the APUS WaterTAP community data still today. If we turn to history, we can see decades and decades of drinking water contamination concerns throughout the United States. The focus depicted in the table shown here is chemical concerns, but we do find in practice that biological concerns can play a compounding role in drinking water. In many cases, both chemical and physical concerns play a driving role in issues at the same location over time. And as we can see in the video graphic, these concerns, they're widespread across the US, and that's just like our student body here at APUS. And so we thought this was a nice topic to really match how we're located throughout everywhere, and so are these same water concerns. While this slide offers some general references, we wanted to include these for the audience, especially if you wanted to come back and take a look at these in the future. We also wanted to plug that we've built an ArcGIS story map that we've published, and we're wanting to share this out as well. This one is specific to the drinking water in the news that we've just gone over. It's an interactive map where you can check out some of these case studies. And a little bit later on, we'll also plug our main ArcGIS story map page as well. These additional references we've included because we want you to understand that there's really a depth of cases all over the US, from North Carolina, South Carolina, Louisiana. These are all related specifically to the Flint, Michigan situation. And here are some from California, Mississippi, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Hawaii, New Jersey, etc., Massachusetts, right? So coast to coast, even on Hawaiian Islands, we have drinking water concerns. Again, we've included these mostly in case anyone is interested in more, but also to see the tie-in between what students are learning in the class and how they connect this with our WaterTAP project. And so that takes us into not only appreciating what the students are learning in the classroom regarding drinking water regulations and the contemporary relevance in real-world case studies, but also what we found in the database. Because not only are we offering a hands-on activity for the students, but now we have real data that we can report out on our drinking water as well. What follows is a review of the water quality findings. We had 11 test parameters that Dr. Messina mentioned earlier. And what we've done is we've compared them against that history that I've just given you. So we're looking against the National Primary Drinking Water Regulations, which have maximum contaminant level goals and maximum residual disinfectant level goals. And then there are also secondary drinking water standards, which include regulations for some of the things that are more aesthetic in nature. So for the parameters related to aesthetics or corrosion control, we have compared some of these findings as well to measurements that we find in authorities on water, such as that by Spellman. And the audience can further explore these regulatory guidelines through the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency resources beyond just the explanations that we've offered here. We just want you to know that they are based on the regulatory standards, should you like to dive into those further. So WaterTAP spans 2019 to 2023, and it's ongoing. We have 41% of the data collected in 2021 and 47% was collected in 2022. The current analysis includes 206 samples and 194 unique zip codes, and we represented 42 states and 2 U.S. territories. And so recall when we discussed how drinking water systems are classified and regulated. Over 3/4 of the samples in WaterTAP are from the public supply, with 18% from private wells, and about 5% either students didn't report where they were from, or there's something like a small community water system or community well that isn't fitting into those other categories. That actually matches fairly well with the U.S. distribution of water, maybe a little higher on the public supply side. So this panel of box and whisker charts presents the findings. In this case, it's for chlorine, pH, alkalinity, and hardness. And we wanted to walk you through how to interpret these charts, since I'm going to show you a handful of them. So these darker boxes here, these specifically are going to always represent the public water supply in the slides. The green ones are going to be the private wells. And then these light blue ones are those other water systems that were undefined by the students who submitted the data. When you're reading these boxes, the shaded solid rectangles, you see those are the first through third quartiles of the data for reporting. Remember, there's 200 total samples in each one of these charts that are shown. The whiskers lines, those are extending out from the boxes, and those represent the normal range of the data if we looked at its distribution. And then the dots that are here, those are considered the outliers in the data set. So they're beyond several standard deviations of the mean for each one of these. And then the last thing that you need to read on these charts are these dashed lines, and those represent whatever particular standard meets that parameter that we're looking at. So sometimes it's the MRDLG, sometimes it's the MCLs. It just depends on specifically which parameter we have. But those dashed lines are thresholds. Either they shouldn't be exceeded or the data should fall within those lines, generally speaking. So let's look specifically at chlorine. Most samples fall under the regulatory threshold for chlorine, which is commonly used disinfectant in U.S. drinking water treatment. And that's why we measure for it, because we do add it into the water system for health reasons. As expected, few private wells have chloride present because few add them in any large dose to their wells. And in total, about 6% of the samples exceeded the maximum residual disinfectant level goals of 4 milligrams per liter. If we look at pH, we monitor pH because it influences both chemical and biological processes in water. For example, pH is adjusted to control coagulation and corrosion in water treatment. And if we have high levels of pH or if we have low levels of pH, it can inhibit microorganism growth. While some samples do fall within the national secondary drinking water regulations, the standard range is about 6.5 to 8.5, depicted there with the dashed lines. The WaterTAP samples often fall outside this range, and we actually had about 1/4 of the readings that were either higher or lower than the 6.5 to 8.5 pH range. In reviewing alkalinity and hardness, we think about these parameters in particular because of the role they play in drinking water treatment. Moderate alkalinity helps to buffer against pH changes. And in WaterTAP, we found that 4% of the samples have high alkalinity greater than 200 parts per million, which is one of the thresholds for review. And over 50% of the samples actually have low alkalinity, below 80 parts per million. So we're not really hitting that threshold that we're looking for ideal alkalinity readings. Regarding water hardness, which is a common water parameter for aesthetics, nearly half of the samples are classified as moderately hard with hardness readings between 75 and 150 parts per million. That's sort of the target range, and we're about 50% of our samples are meeting that. All right, and just as those first 4 panels showed us an overview of some data, the next set that we're going to look at is nitrate, nitrite. And these are 2 forms of nitrogen often found in water samples, and of course concerns because nutrients in our water, but also because nitrogen can have health effects and cause us to lose oxygen in our blood supply, which is a pretty challenging thing to have happen. We don't want nitrogen in our waters. And then also 2 metals, we have copper and iron there in the bottom panels. So let's look at these more closely. In all of the water sources, few of the samples reported concentrations of nitrate and nitrogen. Again, this is the favorable reading. We don't want those in our waters. For nitrate, only 1 sample is reported to exceed the MCLGs. Again, that's the maximum contaminant level goal of 10 parts per million. And 15 samples were reported they actually fell at the MCLGL. So that's sort of borderline of what we would like to see. We don't really want it to be at the goal. We want it to be well below it. But the bulk of the samples, about 80% for nitrates, had 0 detection, and even more, about 95% of the samples for nitrite had no nitrite detected in them. So that overall is good news for the nitrogen findings in the water samples. So if we turn our attention to copper and iron, most samples for both copper and iron are either at or below their respective MCLGs. All water supply sources do have exceedances for copper, so that's public supply, private wells, and the other categories do have copper readings that exceed their standards. Not many, but they are there. Findings for iron were mostly below the MCLGs, with 77% of the samples detecting no iron and about 6% having exceedances. What was interesting is if you look at the iron chart, the range for the samples, so the highest and the lowest were about the same for the public supply and the private wells. But if you look at the mean concentrations, the private wells have almost 2.5 times higher iron levels than the public supplies did. So we thought that was something interesting, not unexpected, because this water is probably coming from groundwater sources, which may be iron rich, but still something interesting to find in our data. All right, and then so the next two slides, these have a different kind of chart on them. So I just wanted to show you what we're looking at in these charts as well. The data here are being reported per each water supply. So that's public, private, and other, those three columns, as a percent total of the sample. That's why our y-axis is 100%. And the light blue portion, which I have highlighted, it shows you the percent of the samples testing negative. Then the red is the percent of the samples testing positive. And the gray hatch, this shows the samples that had no results. And this to us was important because it meant that the test failed. It didn't tell us if it was positive or negative. Nothing conclusive could be found. And I think that helps us understand some of the error inherent in the, sort of quick at-home testing that we do, at least to understand that not all of these tests are going to be returning positive or negative results for us. But if we look at the bacteria presence, we said 6% of the samples did have a positive indicator for bacteria. And that range is somewhere between 5 and 9% across the water supply categories. So our goal for these would be 0 bacteria present. So that wasn't a fantastic finding. It was, of course, a low percent at 6% of our samples. Overall, few samples likewise reported positives for lead or pesticides. But again, the ideal conditions for these would be that all of the bars would be completely absent, no findings whatsoever for these, but that wasn't the case. So we have 6% of the samples that tested positive for bacteria, and the positives, as you can see on the upper chart, are occurring both in the public supply and in the private well samples. And then for lead, which is the bottom panel, we only found, I say only, and I don't mean to, because whenever you find lead, you don't want to find lead in your water supply, but we did find 2% of the samples tested positive, and those were all in the public supply. So none of those were in private wells or the other water systems. So as a summary of the data findings, we would say that most, but not all of the samples in the WaterTAP data set met regulatory standards, and there was a little bit more flexibility in those secondary or aesthetic recommendations that we talked about for things like alkalinity and hardness. 25% of the samples did fall outside of the ideal pH range. Some were higher and some were lower. And about half of the samples have low alkalinity and are moderately hard. Copper occurs at the MCLG in most samples across the water supply type. And that was probably the one thing that was most uncomfortable for us in the findings. We don't want to see copper at the MCLG. We want to see it well below. And while we did find iron in just under a quarter of the water supplies, it was nearly always in the private wells in greater concentrations, so about 2.5 times higher if it occurred in the private wells. When we looked at pesticides and bacteria, they occurred in about 6% of the samples across the board, and lead was detected again in about 2% of the samples, and those were all in the public water supply. So as we continue to build our WaterTAP data set, the project, is still developing. We still have data coming in, and we're enjoying looking at what is the quality of our drinking water and that of our student community as well. So we have had some challenges along the way, and I'll turn this over to Daniela to share some more.
Thanks, Kelly. So WaterTAP, as Kelly mentioned earlier, began in late 2019 and had a slow start because of the COVID-19 limitations that we had. And these, you can see along this kind of roadway map, included COVID-19 disruptions to businesses, general life worldwide, including mailing, our military students being in flux with their deployments, which impacted testing kit requests, the receipt of them, and also the reporting of their results. Shipping disruptions causing postal delays and losses. The relatively small class size of EVSP 310. And participant follow-up results reporting due to many aspects of the daily life of our students and their households just being disrupted in general. So, however, the project picked up within 2022 and 2023, and we're going to continue to build the WaterTAP database along with coming up with further correlations to the information and data that we are gathering. In the meantime, we've already started integrating WaterTAP into student learning, and it looks like this for you. So in the EVSP Water Science course, we have several opportunities to engage with the WaterTAP data set in discussions and in a case study assignment. whether students are able to participate in the sampling or not, they're still offered a portion of the WaterTAP data set, which they can then communicate their analysis of and their findings to their professors and their classmates. A section of this course's work focuses on understanding drinking water treatment, and this citizen science-driven data set presents a real-world application of otherwise abstract and technical standards for the students. So how do the students feel about participating in WaterTAP, and what have they gotten out of their experience? And I'll just take you through a couple of those. I'll highlight here on the screen just a couple of the comments. And in general, just to speed this along, because I know that we have Charlie right after us and I want to be sensitive to Charlie, there's just a few things to highlight, which includes students who involve their families, they involve their communities, they are involving also their public spaces and also military bases, which is of concern as we mentioned earlier in historic data. So thanks for your attention thus far, and Kelly's going to wrap it up for us.
All right, great. So just as a recap, we basically have tried to reach out to students. We think that students in the general public from our findings generally don't realize that their water isn't completely distilled or sterile, that there are impurities within our drinking water, and we have regulatory limits of how much of a chemical compound can exist. So WaterTAP helps us bridge or provide students with that opportunity to really understand their own drinking water locally and then across the US with our data set, and to take the data collection and the analysis and bring that sort of real world experience of testing data into their own classrooms. Our inspiration for selecting water testing was the basis for all of the news stories we told you about before, just to understand where this framed our research questions. We've been working on WaterTAP for several years, and we've done all kinds of fun things with it, to be honest. We've done a Twitter symposium, and we've done research fests, and we've presented at City Science Conference, and we have another one coming up next week as well. So we've been trying to really, use this information and share it out as well. And we remain interested in ways of finding ways to promote really hands-on learning for our students. And WaterTAP seems to be one way that we can engage those students. Most of our students, you all are probably familiar, are non-traditional students, and they have military backgrounds. And it's just a way for us to get them, again, to engage with this real-world topic. Thank you for joining us all today for our presentation. If you wanted to learn more about Dr. Messina and I, you can check out our bios here. And then also, if you wanted to reach us in any way, we wanted to drop our emails. We have a water project email as well. It's called watertap411@gmail.com. We have a Twitter account, which is active mostly when we present. And then we also have our ArcGIS story map, which has been a lot of fun. It's still in the build phase as far as us being, learning that process, but we just wanted to basically share this out in as many ways as we could. So we hope that the project has given you sort of a how-to and inspired you to engage with students in participatory science. We thank you for spending time with us today, and thanks to APUS Graduate Studies for hosting us and for funding us as well. We have just a minute or two, I guess, for questions. So I'll turn it back over to Jenny.
Well, thank you. And we have a couple of comments in the chat, among them from Sherry Hernandez, an offer to perhaps recruit some more students into your project. So definitely take a look at her comment, and if you're interested in following up. Any other questions from the group right now?
And I'll go ahead and ask Kelly to just advance one more slide, because being that we're professors, we always have questions. So if you want to take a look at the questions that we have posted here, maybe it'll kind of jog you a bit on how to incorporate something similar into one of your classes, or perhaps if you want to reach out to any of these questions, reach out to us with any of the answers to these questions that you might have. We would love that.
Yeah, I will say, I think I get the most benefit of this project because I have the 310 water science class. So Dr. Messina doesn't get to share the sort of student engagement in the same way. So I'm always sharing with her what they're saying. But it's been really rewarding to see them be able to use this data in their projects. So.
Really cool. And thank you for providing the discussion questions for people to think about. And just for the framework of citizen science and thinking about how that might be incorporated into more classes in the university. So I want to thank both Dr. Reiss and Dr. Messina for that presentation. I'm going to stop this recording.